all doing so well today. I'm just going to jump into the topic today. I want to make sure that all of this gets out, and we're basically just going to be capitalizing on what I talked about last week, right? This is just a supplemental episode to last week's episode, which was on the role of fear. If you haven't yet, I want you to go back and listen to that because it gives a great overview about what happens in our brain, what the role of fear is, why fear is important, why we don't need to fear in the way that we think we do, right? The idea is just to pull the veil back around fear so that it is less intimidating, so that fear isn't quite as powerful. With this episode, with that background knowledge, with this episode, I wanted to provide a little bit more nuance to something that I see pretty universally with my clients, which is the fear of hope. It is a really common theme. I would actually argue that just about everyone that I've talked to, whether it was like a client that I was coaching, myself, my friends and their experiences with IVF and infertility, it's a very universal theme that at some point we have some or a lot, a very strong or high fear of hope. And it can take on a lot of different kind of flavors. Sometimes people will say things like, I don't want to get ahead of myself, or I can't get too excited, I can't get too hopeful. And those are elements, those are ways that we explain or describe how we fear hope. So this episode speaks specifically to that. And I think most of us can relate to saying something like that at some point in our lives. But those phrases live on repeat in the heads and in the mouths of IVFers. So let's start with hope. I haven't talked about hope in a while. So when you hope for something, you yearn for it, you long for it, but you're not really sure if you'll actually get it, right? You really hope that you do, but you're not sure, right? That makes it different from optimism, which is inherently a strong belief that you will get what it is you long for, right? When you hope for this something, you're giving a greater importance to it than you did before you began hoping, which is why I think the moment we kind of decide we want to have children or we want to have more children, it becomes this tunnel vision thing that we just can't kind of break ourselves out of. That is why we become so focused, because we've now given it greater importance in our lives. So as a result, our potential or possible disappointments over that loss, the loss of not getting what we want, or in IVF's case, the loss anywhere along the way, because we have so many opportunities for loss, but it becomes more intense. That fear becomes more intense the more that we hope for it. The higher up the hill of hope that you go, the farther you think you're going to fall, because you're making that goal more and more important as you pursue it. Another way that I've heard hope described is that it's kind of like an investment. If you have a goal, you have to invest in that hope, right? The goal, you're investing in the goal for it to be realized. Maybe you have to invest time or money, physical comfort or discomfort, social capital, right? Depending on what it is that you're hoping for or what it is your goal is. You have to invest faith that the world, right, depending on your goal, or in IVF, that science will support your goal or hopes, right? That your body will support your goals and hopes. All of these things, right? And so then you have to kind of risk your own feelings of self-worth, because if you risk moving towards an important goal like having children, there's a chance that your investment may not turn out the way you want it to. And there's so many of us who have invested tens of thousands of dollars and we haven't gotten anything, or we haven't gotten as much or what we wanted, right? It looks very different for all of us. And so when we're risking our feelings of self-worth, then when we don't get that thing, we tend to end up feeling bad or even worse about ourselves. And that's where for us it gets so tricky, because any perceived or actual quote unquote failure we tend to internalize that as a reflection of ourselves or our self-worth, right? We personalize my eggs, my uterus, my ovaries, my womb, my worthiness, my deservedness of being a mom or a parent. And then to add to that, within the infertility and IVF community, hope is like touted as this magical elixir that is required for success, right? If you don't feel hopeful, then you're clearly doing something wrong, or whatever it is, won't work for you. And for many of us, there is no nuance in terms of what our understanding around feelings is. What I mean is, if we feel like we should feel hopeful, we tend to interpret that as I should only feel hope, like that should be my exclusive emotion, or that I should feel hope 100% of the time. Both of which are unrealistic expectations. And when we can't possibly maintain or meet that, then we start to internalize that as a personal failing as well. When in truth, it's really just that you're human. I know that that's a really boring answer, and I say that a lot, but it's true. We were never designed to only feel one emotion at a time. We were never designed to feel 100% unwavering of one emotion, let alone hope. We are complex and dynamic people who are capable of holding more than one thought and more than one emotion, more than one experience at the same time. And this is no different. So when you take all of that into consideration, it makes complete sense why when you're faced with failure after failure, and some of us even more than that, you develop this fear of hope. I think ultimately the fear of hope comes down to a feeling of helplessness, right? So you have decided you want a child or more children, and this is something that is so important to you, right? On such a primitive, guttural, visceral, spiritual level, right? And maybe it's based in a need or a feeling of lack, right? We don't need to get into that. But when you're doing everything you can to make that happen or to support it happening, and it's not working for a variety of reasons, that is demoralizing. So then hope becomes the enemy. And as this happens repeatedly over time, we develop this deeply, deeply entrenched feeling of helplessness, this belief that we can't either get our own needs met or meet our own needs. Like we can't even meet our own needs, not only in one or maybe two specific areas, but in all, right? So like, because our brain can be this really unhelpful, like co-conspirator to our misery, then if one part of our life, it's true that we feel helpless, what our brain does is like extrapolates that to mean that, oh, all areas or most areas of our life, we are helpless in, right? So we take that thing that we're struggling with and we convince ourselves that we're struggling in all manners or in most manners of our lives. So naturally, when that happens, we want to avoid this incredibly painful feeling. And so we decide, understandably so, the best thing to do is just not hope, right? Because hope takes us back to that possibility of losing something or ourselves again. And that experience is incredibly traumatic. There's a doctor out of, I believe, Rutgers University, Dr. Ross Ellenhorn, who has done a lot of research around hope and the fear of hope. And in one of his research studies, he found that people who have a fear of hope experience a wide range of psychological challenges, as you can imagine, right? Increased rates of depression, increased rates of anxiety, difficulty with emotional regulation, low self-esteem, and low optimism, to name a few. In his words, they lack positive resource while they have a surplus of negative states. So most of the painful situations that we experience in our lives, not just infertility and IVF, are when both hope and fear are high. Dr. Ellenhorn also found that high hope and high fear of hope are more strongly correlated with higher rates of anxiety than low hope and high fear, or obviously high hope and low fear of hope. What I notice is how the combination of high hope and high fear of hope, to use Dr. Ellenhorn's words, affect what we call counterfactuals. I did a podcast episode a while ago on counterfactuals, but essentially it's a way of looking back at the decisions that we've made in our lives. So take someone who has a history of smoking, and they might not smoke anymore, but maybe they smoked for 5 years, 10 years ago, right? And they're going through IVF now. And they might say to themselves if they encounter some really hard news or failures or something like that, if I had never smoked, I would not be here. That is a counterfactual because we don't know that that's true, right? There's no way of knowing or proving that to be true. And most importantly, and I can't overemphasize this, like most importantly, it's not helpful because we can't go back and change the past. That's what makes counterfactuals so difficult. That's why we tend to ruminate on these things. I should have gone to the doctor earlier. I should have lost weight. I should have exercised more. Whatever the counterfactual might be, those tend to be the things that we ruminate on, aside from trying to see into the future, which I think all of us want to do. But that kind of rumination seems especially prevalent for people who have both hope and fear of hope. People who don't fear hope and don't have hope don't really experience this kind of rumination, as you can imagine. Now, I will fully acknowledge that this is completely anecdotal data from my observations and personal experience, professional experience, friendship experience, but I think it's relevant nonetheless. I will even notice that when I ask my clients who have a high fear of hope to think about their future, like how many positive things that they can imagine happening for them, it can be really challenging for them to come up with examples. It's as if they can't even allow themselves to think about positive future events. It's always curtailed with, but I don't know, that probably won't happen, it hasn't happened, I can't imagine it happening, right? And it's from that I want to talk about how we can ease or start to lessen the grip or loosen the grip on our fear of hope. So from a neurobiological perspective, the circuits in our brain for fear and hope are counterposed. I think that's the word for it. So when I was finishing my bachelor's degree, I was working my first big girl social work job. I lived in like this old brownstone building. I love that building so much, but I could not run, let's say, my hairdryer and the oven at the same time. Those circuits were counterposed. I really think that's the word. Yeah, it wasn't like a huge inconvenience because I was 22 and I was much less interested in cooking than, say, going out. But this is what it's like for the circuits of hope and fear in our brains. They can't really be online at the exact same time, right? We can feel hope and fear, and we can feel it kind of ebb and flow, but to have hope and fear at the exact same time, especially at those first moments of like where the fear really hits you and maybe you start to experience some of those similar anxiety sensations, they don't really get to exist at the same time. What tends to happen is that maybe you're starting to think about possibility or you're starting to think about hope, and then fear kicks on and the circuit shifts, right? So it's like you turn the hope circuit on and then something will happen, maybe a thought will happen, or literally something happens, a new information comes or a situation, and then fear is introduced, and then you can't really access that hope. So in order to unlock or untangle some of the fear of hope, I want you to start intentionally thinking about things that can create excitement for you, leading to a feeling of hope. So what this is setting aside time to be intentional where you allow yourself to feel hopeful without cutting it at its knees by saying, oh, I can't think that like that. I can't get too far ahead of myself. So I call this equal airtime. The fear isn't going anywhere. That's not the goal. The goal is to allow yourself to experience hope and fear in equal measure because everything is 50-50. Life is 50-50. 50% of the time it's going to be good or easy or peaceful or even neutral. 50% of the time it's going to be hard or challenging or whatever words or emotions that you want to assign to those. But it's always going to be 50-50. Okay? So let's say we start small. And you can journal about this, you can talk about it out loud to yourself, or you can just spend time thinking about it. If you're kind of new to this work, I would probably encourage you to write more than just think by yourself, because it kind of helps you stay on task or on topic a little bit more. But maybe that's just a me thing. But you're going to intentionally decide for 2 minutes that you're going to acknowledge your fear, right? You're not going to indulge in it. You're not going to let yourself necessarily go on some like fear safari where everything is dark and scary, but you're going to acknowledge your fear. I am feeling fear around ... and list those things. You don't have to logically challenge them. You're just acknowledging them. They're valid. Whatever it is that you're feeling, it's a valid fear. So you're just taking time to acknowledge that. Then, for the exact same amount of time, let's say 2 minutes, I want you to think about all the possibilities. Yes, literally doing this for that short amount of time, it kind of creates this safety, right? That I don't have to just indulge and lean into my fear, and I don't have to cut my hope off at the knees. I get to do both at the same time because you're giving them both equal airtime. The time constraint is really important, and I don't want you to overlook that, okay? I would prefer, I think it's more useful, I guess I should say, if you attack the fear first and then the hope, so that you're not leaving yourself on the second with fear and kind of leaning into that. You're allowing yourself actually at the end of the experience to be filled up with a little bit more hope or possibility. But the time constraint is really important because it allows you, again, that time to acknowledge what you're fearing and where that fear lives in your body. And this can be an incredibly validating experience because most of us walk around trying to ignore our fear or push past it, or are only experiencing the physical sensations of that anxiety that's a result of our fear. And you get to enjoy the feeling of hope without needing to knock yourself down with the, oh, I can't let myself go there, I can't get too excited thoughts, because you've already acknowledged the fear, right? It's okay to have both. And then you just repeat this exercise, increasing the time until the hope doesn't feel so dangerous. Because that's the point. Hope isn't actually dangerous. If you have failed cycle or a failed transfer or a miscarriage, it's gonna hurt. It's gonna be terrible. You're not gonna get around that by cutting yourself off from hope. Cutting yourself off from hope isn't gonna lessen the blow in any way. It just means that you don't get to experience hope in any capacity or a very limited capacity. You're living mostly in that fear. Fear of hope and cutting yourself off from the hope never does what you think it will. It never makes disappointment or pain less painful. It just makes it to where you don't get to feel any hope or any peace. Because, and I'll leave you with this, right? Most importantly, this work in healing and processing your fear and fear of hope isn't to handle your grief or your fear. You know how to do that. If you're listening to this podcast, you're learning more and more how to do that. By doing this work, you're healing to allow hope and to allow joy, not the other stuff. Healing isn't about the things that you think it is, right? Because that's not what pop culture psychology tells us. Healing is about allowing the good stuff in your life. And that is what you deserve, every ounce of it. Okay, so that is what I have for you today. I hope you have a great week, and I will talk to you soon.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of IVF This. If you like what you've heard, click subscribe and follow to make sure you don't miss an episode. And if you want to learn more, head over to www.ivfthiscoaching.com to learn how to work together.